They called it a routine inspection. 17 code violations, effective immediately. Restaurant closed. Inspector Dale Pruett posted the notice himself, pressed the tape flat against the door, and walked back to his car without once looking in her direction. As if she weren't standing right there. As if 43 years of her mother's recipes, 3 years of her own labor, and a neighborhood that called this place home were just a building he was done with. Celestine Rucker stood on that sidewalk and read every line. Then she took out her phone, and she photographed it. She didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't give him the satisfaction of watching her come apart on the same street where her mother Ozella used to sweep the steps every morning before the lights came on. She went home. What she didn't know, what nobody knew, was that 6 days before Pruett posted that notice, the security camera she'd installed in the alley after a break-in had been running. Recording. Backing up to a cloud she hadn't checked in 3 weeks. And it had seen everything. The envelope changing hands, the man in the gray suit, and a voice in the background, audible, clear, undeniable. Tell him we'll have this block cleared by end of Q3. Celestine Rucker didn't walk into a trap. She was the trap. She just didn't know it yet. If you love stories about ordinary people who refuse to be erased, communities that fight back, and justice that actually lands, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. There's so much more coming. To understand what was taken from Celestine Rucker, you have to understand what she was protecting. And to understand that, you have to start with Ozella. Ozella Rucker opened the restaurant in 1987 with $4,000, a 2-year lease, and a recipe box that had come down through 3 generations of women who cooked like they were trying to save somebody. No investors, no business plan, no safety net worth mentioning. Just her grandmother's handwriting on index cards, each one a prayer disguised as a recipe, a neighborhood that was hungry, and a certainty so quiet it never needed to announce itself. The neighborhood changed around her. Twice. First in the 90s, when the block went lean and 2 storefronts went dark and stayed dark. Ozella kept cooking. Then again in the 2000s, while when the coffee shops started appearing and the rent started climbing and the long-time residents started doing the math, Ozella kept cooking. 31 years behind that counter, 31 years of the same biscuit recipe, the same collard greens, the same Friday catfish that people drove across the city to sit down for. The restaurant didn't survive the neighborhood changing. The restaurant was the reason some people stayed. Then dementia came for Ozella. Slowly at first, a missed order here, a forgotten name there, then faster, then completely. By the time she could no longer stand at the stove without someone beside her, the restaurant that had outlasted 2 neighborhood transformations was suddenly in danger of outlasting the woman who built it. Celestine was an HR director, stable salary, benefits, a career built on exactly the kind of precise, methodical competence that corporate environments reward. She was good at her job. She liked her job. Running a restaurant had never been the plan. She'd grown up watching her mother do it and understood intimately what it cost. She came home anyway. She knew nothing about running a restaurant. She learned everything: suppliers, permits, staffing, the city's inspection protocols, the health code down to the subsection. She treated the learning the way she'd treated everything in her life, completely, with documentation. Her first city inspection, perfect score. Every inspection after that, perfect score. She was not running her mother's restaurant out of sentiment alone. She was running it like someone who understood that, in a city that was changing fast, saw perfection was the only language certain people were forced to speak just to be left alone. The regulars came with the building. Moselle Hurd had been coming every Tuesday morning for 19 years. Her and a rotating table of women in their late 70s who treated the corner booth like a standing appointment with something sacred. They didn't just come for the biscuits, though the biscuits were worth the trip. They came because this was one of the last places in the neighborhood where the room felt like it used to feel. where nobody looked at them like they were in the way. The high school across the street sent its students for the lunch special every day school was in session. Celestine knew half of them by order. A few of them had started working for her on weekends. And then there was the catering operation, something Celestine had built herself, from nothing, in the 3 years since she'd taken over. Corporate accounts, church events, a city council luncheon once. By the time Pruett posted that notice on her door, catering made up 40% of the restaurant's revenue. Celestine had not just maintained what her mother built, she had expanded it. She had also been watching the block. 3 vacancies in the last 18 months, 2 of them quietly bought by the same LLC, a name she didn't recognize, an address that traced back to a registered agent in a midtown office building. She'd looked it up, written it down, mentioned it to no one in particular. In a city moving this fast, strange purchases weren't necessarily sinister. Sometimes they were just money looking for somewhere to land. She filed it away, kept her permits current, kept her inspections clean, kept cooking. She believed, the way people believe things they've never had reason to question, that if she did everything right, the system would leave her alone. She was about to learn what the system had already decided. It didn't start with Celestine. That was the genius of it, if you want to call something that calculating genius. It started small. It started elsewhere. It started in places she could see, but had no particular reason to scrutinize. Because on a block full of small businesses in a city with an active code enforcement department, a citation here and there isn't a conspiracy. It's a Tuesday. 6 weeks before the shutdown, Quentin Fambro got the first notice. Improper ventilation in the back of his barbershop, a room that had been set up the same way for 11 years without a single prior complaint. The citation was specific, technical, and signed by one Inspector Dale Pruett. Quentin didn't fight it. He called a contractor, had the ventilation corrected, got his documentation, and submitted it to the city within the week. Done. He mentioned it to Celestine in passing one afternoon, the way neighbors mention parking tickets, and she nodded and said something about the city getting stricter, and meant it. 2 weeks after that, the flower shop at the corner received its own notice. Electrical violations, 2 outlets in the back room that allegedly didn't meet updated code standards. The owner, a woman named Paulette, who had been arranging flowers on that corner for 14 years, fixed it out of pocket and didn't make a sound about it, because she'd heard that fighting the city cost more than compliance, and she had a business to run. Then the Caribbean Bakery, 3 doors in the other direction. Signage non-compliance. The lettering on their awning was reportedly 2 inches taller than current permit specifications allowed. 2 inches. The owner repainted the sign himself on a Sunday, filed the correction Monday morning. 1 citation, then another. Then another. Each one spaced out by just enough time to feel routine. Each one handled quietly by an owner who understood, from lived experience, that arguing with city inspectors was a losing proposition. Each one filed by the same inspector, Pruett, though none of the business owners had any reason yet to be comparing notes on who was signing what. The citations didn't arrive as a pattern. They arrived as inconveniences. And inconveniences, by design, get dealt with individually. Then it reached her. Grease trap irregularities, a maintenance deficiency in the kitchen's grease interceptor that, according to Pruett's report, posed a potential drainage compliance risk. And Celestine read the notice the same way she read everything, completely, carefully, and without panic. She picked up the phone before the morning was out, had the trap professionally serviced by the end of the next day. Got written confirmation from the contractor on company letterhead. Date, time, scope of work, certification number. Filed it with the city the same afternoon it was in her hands. Perfect compliance. Documented. Time stamped. She told herself what any reasonable person running a small business in a gentrifying city would tell themselves. Standards were tightening. The neighborhood was changing, money was moving in. And when money moved in, enforcement followed. It wasn't personal. It was the cost of operating in a city that was updating itself. She had done what she always did. She had responded immediately, correctly, and with documentation. She was not wrong about the city changing. She was wrong about what was driving it. Here is the thing about a pattern designed to be invisible. It works precisely because each person inside it is only seeing their own piece. Quentin saw a ventilation notice. Paulette saw an electrical citation. The bakery owner saw a sign that needed repainting. Celestine saw a grease trap that needed servicing. None of them were looking at the block as a whole because they were each too busy solving their individual problem, which is exactly what Dale Pruett and the man directing him were counting on. Compliance kept them isolated, and isolation kept them blind. If any one of them had stepped outside, and looked at the last 60 days from a distance, the dates, the names, to the inspector's signature repeated 7 times across 7 businesses on a single block, they would have seen it immediately. But that was the point. Nobody had stopped yet. He arrived at 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, not a Monday, when the week was fresh and the block was quiet. Not a Friday, when she'd have the weekend to absorb it before the lunch crowd came back. A Tuesday, Moselle Herd's day, the day the restaurant filled earliest, the day the high school kids arrived in the first wave before second period. The timing was not accidental. None of it was accidental. Inspector Dale Pruett posted the notice himself. Pressed each strip of tape flat with the palm of his hand, the way someone does when they want a thing to stay. 17 violations, printed in the standard city format, effective immediately. He did not knock, did not wait, did not look in Celestine's direction once before he walked back to his car, got in, and drove off the block like he'd just dropped off a package. And Celestine stood on the sidewalk and read it. Every line. While her customers, the ones who had been about to walk in for biscuits and the Tuesday special, stood at a distance and watched her read it. While Moselle Herd, already at the corner, stopped walking and pressed a hand to her mouth. While a 17-year-old from the high school across the street stood on the opposite curb, looked at the yellow notice, looked at Celestine, and pulled out his phone. By noon, his photo had 200 shares. They closed Mama Rucker's. No caption beyond that. None was needed. The comments came in fast. Disbelief, then anger, then the particular grief of a neighborhood watching something it loves disappear in real time. People who hadn't been to the restaurant in months suddenly remembered exactly what the biscuits tasted like. So that is what loss does. It makes the specific unbearable. She did not see the post until later. She was already home by then, already at the kitchen table, already working. The notice was in front of her, flattened out, and she was going through it the way she went through everything, line by line, violation by violation, writing in the margin beside each one what she knew to be true. Grease trap irregularities. Serviced 30 days ago. Contractor documentation filed with the city, time-stamped. Fire suppression system, non-compliance. Inspected 60 days ago, certified. Paperwork on file. Structural integrity concerns. No renovations, no modifications, no structural changes to the building in 3 years. She had the permits, or rather she had the absence of permits that proved nothing had been touched. She went through all 17. 17 violations, 17 entries in her notebook, and beside every single one, in her precise, unhurried handwriting, the documented evidence that it was a lie. She closed the notebook, sat with it for a moment. Then she picked up her phone and called Leandra Bozeman, a civil rights attorney she had met once at a Chamber of Commerce event 3 years earlier, and whose number she had kept in her contacts without ever expecting to use it. She was not the kind of person who kept an attorney's number expecting trouble. She kept it the same way she kept the fire extinguisher under the counter, maintained, current, and hoped to never need. She needed it now. Then she called her nephew Trevian, 22 years old, detail-oriented, the person she trusted with the security system. She told him she needed him to pull the last week of camera footage from the restaurant. She wanted a record of every person who had been in or near the building before the shutdown. If additional violations were coming, she wanted documentation of who had access. She was thinking like an HR director. She was building a paper trail before anyone had told her she'd need one. She did not know yet what Trevian would find. What she did, instead, was pull the recipe box from the cabinet above the refrigerator, the one with Ozella's handwriting on the index cards, and make her mother's biscuits from memory and from the card at the same time, checking each step against the familiar cursive, like she was taking a test she already knew the answers to. She ate them alone at the table where Ozella used to sit. She did not pray out loud. She didn't need to. Her mother had always said the cooking was the prayer, that God heard you clearest when your hands were doing something true. Outside, 200 people were sharing a photograph of a closed door. Inside, Celestine Rucker was already building the case. 3 weeks after the shutdown, Celestine was still waiting. Waiting on the city's appeals process, waiting on Leandra's next filing, waiting on the kind of institutional patience that grinds slowly enough to make you feel like you're the one standing still. She had her notebook. She had her documentation. She had 17 marginal annotations proving 17 violations were fabricated, and none of it had moved a single thing yet. That is how these systems work, not by being right, but by being slow, by making the cost of waiting higher than the cost of settling. She had not settled. Trevian had been in the footage for a different reason entirely. A supplier dispute, a delivery that the vendor claimed had been made, that the restaurant's inventory record said had never arrived, and that someone needed to verify one way or the other before the invoice went to collections. A minor problem in the middle of a major one. He was scrolling through the alley camera recordings methodically, looking for a date stamp on a delivery truck, when he found something that had nothing to do with any of that. He called her at 11:14 p.m. He said, "Auntie, you need to come see this." The footage was from the alley camera, the one she'd installed 3 months earlier after someone had tried the back door in the middle of the night. Motion activated, cloud backed, the kind of system a cautious person puts in quietly and then mostly forgets about. She had forgotten about it. She had not thought to check it because she had no reason to think the alley held anything relevant. She had been looking, like everyone else, in the wrong direction. The timestamp on the recording, 6 days before the shutdown. Inspector Dale Pruett and a man in a gray suit, standing in the alcove beside her dumpster, where the camera angle caught them clean. The man in the gray suit would later be identified as the Regional Acquisitions Director for Crane Development Group. At the time, watching the footage for the first time, he was simply a man in expensive clothes, having a conversation in an alley, at a time and in a location that made the nature of the conversation obvious before the envelope even appeared. The envelope appeared. Pruett took it, looked at it without opening it, folded it once, and put it inside his jacket. The man in the gray suit extended his hand. They shook, and in the background, facing away, one hand in his pocket, one phone pressed to his ear, stood a third figure, broader, a captain's bearing even in civilian clothes, Captain Stanton Mabry. His voice carried in the alley the way voices do when a person doesn't believe they're being recorded anywhere that matters. "Tell him we'll have this block cleared by end of Q3. Celestine watched it once. Then she asked Trevian to go back to the beginning, and she watched it again. Then a third time, slower, her eyes moving between all 3 figures, cataloging the timestamp, the envelope, the handshake, the voice. The third watch was not about disbelief. She had believed it by the end of the first. The third watch was about precision, making sure she knew exactly what she had before she decided what to do with it. She did not call Leandra that night. She did not call anyone. What she did was turn to Trevian and tell him she needed 4 copies of the footage. 2 saved to separate external drives, 1 uploaded to a cloud account Pruett had no possible knowledge of, 1 burned to disk. Different locations, different formats. the instinct of someone who had spent 3 weeks watching a system manufacture evidence against her and understood, with complete clarity, that the thing she was now holding needed to be impossible to make disappear. Trevian made the copies without asking questions. That was the thing about Trevian. He understood when the time for questions was later. She went home. She did not sleep. She sat at Ozella's kitchen table with a fresh page in her notebook, and she wrote down every person she needed to call, in the order she needed to call them, and with a note beside each name explaining exactly what they needed to know and exactly what she needed from them. By the time the sun came up, the list was complete. Celestine Rucker had spent 3 weeks waiting on a system that was designed to outlast her. The system had just run out of time. Leandra Bozeman did not rattle easily. 22 years of civil rights litigation had given her a particular kind of stillness in the presence of bad facts, the ability to look at something ugly without flinching away from its full dimensions. She had seen retaliation dressed up as policy. She had seen discrimination dressed up as procedure. She knew what it looked like when a system was being used as a weapon by people who understood that the weapon's legitimacy was its best disguise. But when Carlton Spence laid the spreadsheet on the table, even Leandra went quiet for a moment. Carlton had come in at Leandra's request, a forensic accountant she kept on retainer for exactly this kind of work, the kind where the story isn't in what anyone said, but in what the dates reveal when you line them up correctly. He had started with public records, nothing exotic, the kind of documents any citizen could request from the city clerk's office if they knew what to ask for and had the patience to wait for the response. Citation histories for every business on the block, inspection dates going back 2 years, the name of the inspecting officer on every report filed in the last 90 days. Every citation issued on that block in the past 90 days had been filed by one inspector, Dale Pruett. All 7 businesses, 7 separate citations, 7 different violation categories: ventilation, electrical, signage, grease trap, fire suppression, structural, drainage. Varied enough to look like independent findings, identical in origin. Then Carlton pulled Crane Development Group's public filings. The preliminary purchase offers are a matter of public record when they involve properties in certain municipal zones, a detail most people don't know because most people have no reason to look. Carlton looked, and what he found was that Crane Development had filed preliminary purchase offers on all 7 properties on that block within a single 60-day window. A window that ended precisely when the citation campaign began. The purchase offers came first. Then Pruett arrived. Carlton cross-referenced Pruett's city employment records with his mandatory financial disclosures. City inspectors at his level are required to report outside income above a certain threshold. Pruett had reported nothing anomalous, which meant either the payments from Crane Development were being kept below the reporting threshold, structured deliberately to stay invisible, or they were being routed through a channel his disclosures didn't capture. Carlton flagged both possibilities. The federal investigators who came later would find the answer. But even without it, what was already visible was enough to make the shape of the scheme undeniable. 7 businesses, 7 citations, 1 inspector, 1 development company, 1 90-day window, 7 purchase offers already drafted and filed before the first notice was ever posted. Carlton put his pen down and said what the spreadsheet already said without him. This was not a code enforcement campaign that happened to benefit a developer. This was a developer's acquisition strategy, implemented through a code enforcement campaign. The sequence of events made any other interpretation geometrically impossible. 3 months later, through civil discovery, the last piece arrived. Crane Development Group's internal communications, emails, meeting notes, project tracking documents produced under court order, contained a memo that nobody at Crane had thought to destroy because nobody at Crane had believed it would ever be read by anyone outside the company. A single page, a project status update, terse, efficient, written in the language of people who think of neighborhoods as line items. Target, East Side Block, clearance timeline, Q3, status, in progress. Not a response to code violations, not a public safety initiative, not a regulatory coincidence, a clearance timeline, a target. A status update written by someone who had scheduled the destruction of 7 businesses the way you schedule a demolition, practically, professionally, and with a completion date already circled on a calendar. Celestine had spent 3 years believing that compliance was protection, that if she kept every permit current, passed every inspection, documented every contractor visit, the city would leave her alone. What the memo confirmed was that the city was never going to leave her alone. Because Crane Development Group had already decided the block was theirs, and someone inside that city had already said yes. The question was no longer whether a crime had been committed. The question was who else had known. Every scheme of this kind has a place where it nearly came apart before it started. A moment where someone inside the machinery was asked to do something that required their cooperation, and didn't give it. The scheme around Celestine's block had one of those moments. It happened 6 months before the shutdown, in a city planning office on the 4th floor of a municipal building on Peachtree Street, and the person who stopped it was a 22-year veteran named Valoria Pugh. Not stopped it permanently. She didn't have that power. But she stopped her part of it, cleanly, completely, and with documentation. And then she waited to see what would happen next. When Leandra submitted the public records request to the city planning office, she was looking for the original code violation reports that would have preceded Pruett's citations, the underlying documentation that city protocol required to exist before any inspection could be formally initiated. Every citation Pruett filed should have been traceable back to a triggering report, a complaint, a referral, a prior inspection flag, something that established, on paper, the legitimate origin of each violation. Several of those documents were missing, not misplaced, not delayed in processing, missing in the specific way that things go missing when someone has decided they shouldn't exist. Gaps in a file that protocol said should be full, absences where the paper trail should have been continuous. Leandra had seen this before. She knew what a document gap looked like when it was accidental, and she knew what it looked like when it was architectural. This was architectural. The gap led to Valoria, in tracking which reports were missing and which office had been responsible for their origination. Leandra's team identified Valoria Pugh as the city planning officer, who had been assigned to process and file several of the foundational documents underlying Pruett's citation campaign. Documents that never made it into the official file. Documents whose absence had been quietly papered over with replacement filings that, to a casual reviewer, would have looked complete. Leandra called her on a Wednesday morning. Valoria picked up on the second ring. And when Leandra introduced herself and explained why she was calling, there was a pause. Not the pause of someone caught off guard, but the pause of someone who had been waiting long enough that the arrival of the call itself needed a moment to land. Then Valoria said, "I have a folder. How soon can you come in?" 6 months earlier, Valoria had been approached, not by Pruett, not by Mabry, but by a mid-level administrator she had worked alongside for a decade, and asked to backdate a set of code violation reports. The backdating was specific and surgical. The reports needed to carry dates that predated Crane Development's purchase offer filings, so that if anyone later examined the sequence, it would appear that the code concerns had existed independently of the developer's interest in the block. The violations first, the purchase offers after. Cause and effect reversed on paper. The whole scheme laundered into legitimacy through a timestamp. Valoria had said no. She had said no. And then she had done something that the person who made the request had almost certainly not anticipated. She wrote it down. She documented the request, who made it, the exact language used, the date, the specific reports she'd been asked to alter. She kept copies of the original unaltered reports. She kept the emails that followed in the days after her refusal, asking again with slightly different framing. the way people do when they believe persistence will eventually replace judgment. She kept her written response to those emails. She kept all of it in a single folder in a filing cabinet in her office, organized chronologically, labeled in her own handwriting. The 22 years in city planning had taught Valoria Pugh one thing above everything else. Institutions protect themselves before they protect the people inside them. If the day came when what she had witnessed became relevant to someone who could act on it, she intended to be the most useful witness in the room. She was not a whistleblower in the dramatic sense. She had not gone to the press, had not filed a complaint with an oversight board, had not taken the risk of exposure without cover. She had simply refused to participate, documented everything, and waited. Not because she was passive, because she was precise. She understood that a document kept in silence and produced at the right moment is worth more than an alarm raised too early into a system that would have buried it. She had the folder. She had been waiting for Leandra, when Celestine had built her case from a security camera she'd forgotten she installed. Carlton had built it from public records anyone could have pulled. And now, Valoria Pugh was adding the interior architecture, the proof that the backdating had been attempted, that the cover-up had been constructed deliberately, that someone inside the city's own planning office had been asked to sand the fingerprints off the scheme and had instead kept every one of them on file. 3 women. 3 separate acts of quiet, methodical refusal to let the record disappear. The scheme had been designed to leave no trace. It had left nothing but. Stanton Mabry had spent 17 years building a career on knowing things before he was supposed to know them. Contacts in the right offices, conversations that happened informally, deniably, in hallways and parking structures, and over coffee that nobody logged. It was how a mid-level police captain accumulated the kind of influence that technically exceeded his rank, not through promotion, but through information, and the selective use of it. When Celestine retained Leandra Bozeman, he knew within 48 hours. He had a contact in the city clerk's office who flagged attorney appearances in active municipal cases. A quiet arrangement, long-standing, the kind that exists in bureaucracies, where the informal network runs parallel to the official one and sometimes runs faster. The flag came through, and Mabry understood immediately what it meant. Celestine Rucker was no longer a business owner waiting out an administrative process. She was a client. She had a lawyer who knew how to move in the specific rooms where this case would need to be fought. He did not wait to see what Leandra's first move would be. Within a week, 6 additional violations were filed against the closed restaurant. Not inspections. Pruett was already too exposed to go near the building again. These were administrative citations, generated through a separate mechanism, targeting the operating license itself. The original 17 violations, even if overturned on appeal, could now exist alongside a license review triggered by the new filings. And license reviews operated on their own timeline, independent of the appeals process, meaning even a complete legal victory on the original citations would not automatically reopen her doors. The review could drag for months. Mabry knew this. The new filings were not about code enforcement. They were about the calendar. Then came the bank. Her primary lender, the institution holding the small business loan she'd taken out 18 months earlier to expand the catering operation, received a communication flagging ongoing compliance concerns associated with the restaurant. The communication came through an unofficial channel, the kind that leaves no clear paper trail, framed as a courtesy notice from someone in a position of municipal authority. The bank's response was procedural and immediate, a formal notification that the loan was under review, pending resolution of the outstanding compliance matters. It was elegant, in the way that cruelty sometimes is when it's been planned carefully. The citations closed the restaurant. The license review extended the closure indefinitely, and the bank communication threatened the financial infrastructure she'd need to reopen, even if she won. Mabry wasn't trying to beat her in court. He was trying to make the cost of staying in the fight higher than the cost of walking away. Then came the posts. 3 separate Atlanta neighborhood groups on Facebook, all active, all followed by the kind of local residents who shared information about road closures and lost dogs and restaurant recommendations. An anonymous account, no profile photo, created recently, no prior activity, began posting in all three. Health concerns at a local soul food restaurant on the east side, a rodent sighting near the kitchen entrance. Heard someone got sick, not sure if it was reported. No names in the posts, just enough specificity to be identifiable and enough vagueness to be difficult to directly dispute. Celestine watched it happen the way she had watched everything since the shutdown, in real time, from a distance, with her phone already in her hand. She had been monitoring the neighborhood groups since the closure, understanding without being told that the same mechanism that had manufactured 17 violations could manufacture a public narrative just as easily. She was not surprised. She was not shaken. She was already screenshotting by the time the second post appeared. When she called Leandra, she read the posts aloud, the anonymous account, the health concerns, the rodent sighting, the carefully unverifiable claim that someone had gotten sick. There was a pause on Leandra's end, the brief pause of a lawyer mentally organizing a new set of charges, and then Leandra said, with the calm of someone adding items to a grocery list, he just added obstruction, witness intimidation, and abuse of process to his own charges. Screenshot the next one, too. For the first time since the Tuesday morning Pruett had pressed tape against her door, Celestine Rucker laughed. Not the laugh of someone who finds something funny. The laugh of someone who has been waiting through weeks of grinding institutional pressure. For the moment, the other side makes a mistake serious enough to matter. Samabri had come after her bank account, her license, and her reputation. And in doing so, he had handed Leandra 3 new federal exposure points, all documented, all time-stamped, all traceable, back to a man who had apparently believed that Celestine was the kind of person who could be frightened into silence. He had misread her from the beginning. From the moment he'd stood in that alley with his phone to his ear, calculating how long it would take to clear a block, he had been operating on an assumption about what Celestine would do when the pressure became unbearable. He had never considered that she might treat every act of pressure as evidence, that she might screenshot the next one, too. The retaliation had not weakened the case, it had expanded it. It took 3 council members, 40 days of procedural maneuvering, and Leandra Bozeman presenting the pattern data in a private briefing that left one of them visibly unable to finish his coffee. But the Atlanta City Council Committee on Business and Economic Development agreed to hold a formal hearing on the citation campaign. Not an investigation. Not yet. A hearing. A public session where testimony could be entered into the record, and the record could no longer be managed by the people who had built it. In a city where the unofficial machinery had been running smoothly for years, a public hearing was the first gear that couldn't be quietly reversed. The chamber filled in a way that city council hearings rarely do, not with lobbyists and administrators and the usual professional attendees who treat municipal proceedings as routine, but with the neighbors, the regulars, the people who had watched 7 businesses on a single block absorb citation after citation and understood, in the wordless way communities understand things before anyone says them out loud, that what had happened was not routine. All 7 business owners were present. Quentin Fambro from the barber shop, Paulette from the flower shop, the Caribbean bakery owner who had repainted his sign on a Sunday and filed the correction on a Monday and never once been thanked for his compliance. All 7 of them, seated together in a row, for the first time in the same room at the same time. A coalition that had been built in Celestine's closed restaurant during the 3rd week of the shutdown and had not broken since. Moselle Hurd and the Tuesday morning table were in the front row. They had arrived early. They had brought their own water. Stanton Mabry was in the back. He had come with his attorney and the particular composure of a man who has weathered institutional scrutiny before and believes he understands the ceiling of what these proceedings can produce. A hearing was not a trial. A hearing was testimony and record, and, at the end of it, a committee recommendation that could be accepted, or shelved, or quietly amended into something toothless. He had seen hearings before. He had seen what happened to them. He sat with his hands folded and his expression arranged into the careful neutrality of someone performing confidence for anyone who might be watching. Pruett was not present. He had retained separate counsel 3 weeks earlier and had been advised, in the clearest possible terms, not to be in that room. When Leandra entered the recording into evidence, she did not editorialize. She did not frame it or prepare the chamber for what they were about to hear. She simply identified the exhibit, confirmed the timestamp, and played it. The alley, the dumpster alcove, the gray-suited man from Crane Development, his hand extended. Pruett taking the envelope, folding it once, slipping it inside his jacket. The handshake. And then, from the background, clear and unhurried, and entirely unaware that an 8-week-old security camera was preserving every syllable. Tell him we'll have this block cleared by end of Q3. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds, long enough that the people in the room could feel its dimensions, long enough to count. Not the silence of shock, though there was shock in it, but the silence of confirmation. The specific quiet that settles over a room when something that many people have long suspected is suddenly, irrevocably, on the record. 4 seconds. Mabry stood. His attorney put a hand on his arm. A firm hand. The hand of someone who had already done the calculation and understood what standing accomplished. Mabry looked at the hand. Then he shook it off. He moved toward the aisle with the bearing of a man who has decided that leaving is still a form of control, that motion is still a form of authority. He walked through the chamber doors into the hallway. 2 federal agents were standing outside. He was arrested before he reached the elevator. The chamber did not erupt. There was no outburst, no rising voices, no moment of dramatic release. It went quiet in a different way than it had gone quiet 4 seconds after the recording ended. Quieter, deeper, the way a room goes when the thing it has been holding its breath for has finally arrived, and the breath can come out slowly, completely, without performance. Moselle Hurd reached over and took Celestine's hand. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that the moment had not already said. 19 years of Tuesday mornings, 31 years of Ozella's biscuits, a security camera installed after a break-in, a nephew reviewing footage for an unrelated dispute, a city planning officer with a folder she had been keeping for 6 months, a forensic accountant who lined up 7 citations, and 1 developer and 1 90-day window, and could not make the numbers say anything other than what they said. And a woman who had spent every day since a yellow notice was pressed to her door, converting each act of cruelty into evidence, each escalation into documentation, each attempt to make her disappear into one more item in a case file that was now, finally, in federal hands. Stanton Mabry had been arrested in a hallway. The block was still standing. The system that had been used against Celestine Rucker was ultimately used to prosecute the people who had used it. That is not always how these things end. It is worth saying clearly, without decoration. This one ended the way it should have, which is not the same as saying it always does. Stanton Mabry, bribery and conspiracy. 11 years. He was sentenced on a Thursday morning and led from the courtroom with the same bearing he had carried into every room of his career, right up until the moment the door closed behind him. Dale Pruett took the cooperation agreement. 18 months. His city inspector's license was permanently revoked, not suspended, not reviewed. A revoked, which meant that the credential he had spent 12 years accumulating and 2 years selling was gone in the same proceeding where he traded what he knew about Mabry for a reduced sentence. The trade was accepted. The license was not returned. Crane Development Group settled the civil case for $4.7 million, distributed across all 7 businesses, proportional to their documented losses. 3 Crane executives, including the regional acquisitions director, who had stood in Celestine's alley in a gray suit and handed over an envelope, faced separate state charges. The Q3 memo once the most confidential document in Crane's possession, became the most expensive page in the city's legal history. The East Side Business Preservation Act passed the City Council 12-1. It was not a symbolic resolution. It had teeth. From the date of its passage, any time a code enforcement agency targeted businesses on a block where a single developer had active purchase offers filed within the previous 12 months, mandatory public disclosure was required before a single citation could be issued. And anytime 3 or more businesses on the same block received citations from the same inspector within a 90-day window, an independent audit was automatically triggered. No request required, no committee vote, no discretion available to the people who might prefer the pattern go unexamined. The law did not exist before Celestine. It exists because of her. Those are not the same thing, and the difference matters. The East Side Business Coalition assembled in Celestine's closed restaurant during the 3rd week of the shutdown, on 7 owners around Ozella's kitchen table, meeting each other properly for the first time, became permanent. They formed a community land trust covering every property on the block. No individual owner could sell to a developer without the unanimous consent of the trust. The block could not be acquired piecemeal. It could not be cleared by attrition. What Crane Development had tried to take apart one citation at a time was now legally bound together in perpetuity. Pruett's citations were expunged from all 7 business records. The 6 additional violations Mabry had filed during the retaliation were dismissed with prejudice, and Celestine's operating license was restored with a formal letter of apology from the city, the first such letter the department had issued in its history. She framed that too. It hangs in the back office where she can see it from her desk and does not need to show it to anyone. On the day of the reopening, the line stretched to the corner before she unlocked the door. Moselle Hurd and the Tuesday morning table were already seated, had been seated for 20 minutes before the restaurant officially opened, because Celestine had let them in early, and nobody had questioned this for even a moment. The kitchen smelled like it always had, like it had smelled for 31 years before Celestine took over and for 3 years after, like something that had survived. The first thing she made was her mother's biscuits. On the wall beside the register, in a plain black frame, is the shutdown notice. 17 violations. Pruett's signature at the bottom. The tape marks still faintly visible at the corners, where he had pressed it flat against her door on a Tuesday morning and walked away without looking at her. Beneath it, on a small card in Celestine's own handwriting, "Some things they shut down come back stronger than they found them. She is not restored. She knows this and does not pretend otherwise." The 3 weeks of closure cost her a supplier who found other accounts and didn't return. 2 employees who couldn't afford to wait out the shutdown and found other work. People she had trained, people she had trusted, people whose absence she still feels during the Friday rush. Approximately $31,000 in revenue that is simply gone, unrecoverable, a cost that no settlement figure accounts for and no letter of apology addresses. The loss is real. It is permanent. It lives alongside everything else. She keeps the shutdown notice on the wall because it is true. It happened. It cost her. And she is still here. The cost and the survival are both true simultaneously, and she has never believed she needed to choose which one to display. The frame holds both. So does she. Somewhere in Atlanta, in a city planning office on the 4th floor of a municipal building on Peachtree Street, Valoria Pugh has a new nameplate on her door. Deputy Director of Business Compliance Oversight, a position that did not exist before this case, created specifically because the city needed someone in that role who already understood, from experience, from documentation, and from the 6 months she spent sitting with a folder and waiting for the right person to call, what the records looked like when someone was trying to make them disappear. The city chose the one person who had already proven she wouldn't let them. Celestine Rucker did not just save her restaurant. She changed the law. She protected a block. She built a coalition out of 7 business owners who had been kept isolated by design, and who discovered, once they found each other, that what they had survived together was stronger than what had been used against them separately. She did all of this because a break-in 3 months before the shutdown had made her cautious enough to install a camera in an alley, because her nephew was thorough enough to review footage he wasn't looking for, because a city planning officer had refused one request. I documented everything and kept the folder. Because Celestine Rucker photographed the notice before she read it a second time and went home instead of breaking on the street and made her mother's biscuits at midnight and treated every act of cruelty as evidence from the very first day. The block is still there, every light still on. Celestine didn't win because she was lucky. She won because she documented everything, trusted the right people, and refused to let the cost of fighting be higher than the cost of losing. If this story hit you the way it hit us, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because the next story is already waiting, and it hits just as hard.